Our moderator tonight is Robert Ruby, a trustee of the council and a great journalist and an experienced foreign correspondent. Robert was stationed as a correspondent in the Middle East for 5 years for the Baltimore Sun, and then he became the foreign editor of the Sun, and he has often returned to the region. Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Roy, very much. And before beginning a conversation with Roy, including your questions, and as Roy said, please ask them anytime through the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. It's a question mark in a small box. Let me set the scene for a moment. I want to ignore geopolitics, the roles of Iran and Russia, what the United States could have or should have done during the civil wars. It lasted more, at least the chapter we know of, lasted more than a dozen years. For a moment, I think we should look at the people of Syria. This is from the UN High Commissioner of Refugees. In Syria's population of 22 million, more than 14 million Syrians have been forced to flee their homes in search of safety. Syria, in the words of the UNHCR, remains the world's largest refugee crisis. As of mid-2024, 7 million Syrians remain internally displaced in their own country. 90% of them live below the UN's truly miserly poverty line. Another 5.5 million Syrians live as refugees in 5 countries in the neighborhood. That's Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt. Germany hosts another 850,000 Syrian refugees. The death toll is staggering. As of March, that's 9 months ago, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights had documented by name the violent deaths of 507,567 individuals since the beginning of the conflict in March 2011. It's verified another 110,000 deaths of people whose names are not known. That brings the total to 617,000. And last, how did this begin? Let's go back to 2011. It's early March. There's at least in my memory, a really dusty city called Dahra. In the southwestern part of the country, it had about 100,000 people when all this began. By 2011, Syria had officially been under emergency rule for 47 years. Gatherings of more than 5 people required a permit. Criticism of the government was more or less prohibited. And in March 2011, in Dahra, there were 15 young people, they were teenagers or younger, wrote some graffiti on a school wall. The graffiti said, "The people want to overthrow the regime." School kids. Police arrested the young people. Their families went to the police station to demand their release. The police killed 3 of the family members. They just fired indiscriminately. A few days later, the protests spread to Damascus and Aleppo, the 2 largest cities. More troops, more demonstrations, then open battles between the demonstrators and security forces. There's no foreign army. These are Syrians demonstrating against their own government. Bashar al Assad said they were foreign-backed terrorists. Here we are, 13 and a half years later, the 617,000 dead, the nearly 8 million refugees, the effects of what began as a student protest ended up affecting the domestic politics of democracies in Europe and here in the United States. Syrian refugees who immigrated to Europe sparked a backlash, anti-immigrant protests in Europe, stronger nationalism, stronger right-wing, far-right political parties. This turn to the right, one could argue, helped lead to Brexit. It helped fuel anxiety about refugees arriving in the United States, so on and so on. It's this long train of unintended and what had been unforeseeable enormous consequences. Now, about Roy Gutman. He reported on the conflict from Syria, from Turkey, from throughout the region, pretty much every day from 2012 to 2018. It's 7 years. That came after years of reporting from Baghdad. It's a pretty good warm-up from one political, military, and economic catastrophe to another. He focused in part on the role of the United States, and Roy would conclude in his words, quote, "Syria is a case not of American overreach, but of underreach." He interviewed literally hundreds of defectors from the Syrian security services. These are the fingernail pullers, the torturers, or worse. He talked with them in Syria. He talked with the defectors in Turkey on many, many occasions. So he's an excellent guide for us for the present. And Roy, I want to start by asking, is the fall of the government in Syria, is it an important event? For whom is it important? What makes the fall of the House of Assad important? I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Robert, so much for that introduction, which does describe uh, certainly the effort I've made to understand the events in Syria, and the people and the forces at play, and the significance for all of us. I happen to think it's an immensely important event. Um, I think many of my countrymen may disagree because it's a little country far away, but it's right in the heart of the Middle East, and people have written it off for years, for decades, because it was run by a ruthless dictatorship. Um, and it wasn't seen as really central, but it turns out it truly is a central location, and I will explain, maybe in a short presentation, if that's okay, why I think it's so important and why it's important that the United States take notice of it. These events of the last 2 weeks are really a moment in history. It was amazing in a sense that it happened so quickly, without a great deal of bloodshed, without a full-blown new war, uh, also without outside intervention. It's a really rare event. One of the big implications of it is that Iran has been dealt a severe setback, and this changes the whole region, not just Syria, but Lebanon too. It may even change politics in Iraq. This all remains to be seen. Russia has departed as a major player, or is in the process of departing as a major player, and that could bring stability, or it could bring instability, depending on whether another power steps in to try to back up the Syrian the new Syrian government. So far, the only candidate, as far as I can see, is Turkey. So you can see Turkey is all across the eastern side of Syria, and Israel is down to the west with Lebanon. Um, and it's a very volatile area, as we know. Um, the whole liberation, if you want, of Syria from its dictator is a signal event. It's a really rare event. A lot of folks are claiming credit for it, who shouldn't be. Israel is claiming credit for the fall of the Assad regime, but it was actually the unintended consequence of Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, which then spilled over into Lebanon, and it's the clobbering it gave to the Hezbollah forces, and then to Iran, because Iran came to Hezbollah's relief and started firing at Israel, and Israel went after Iran. Iran had been using Syria as a pathway to Lebanon and to support its forces in Lebanon, namely its proxy force, the Hezbollah militia there. Um, so I don't think really Israel can rightfully claim credit, although it was instrumental in bringing about the situation that led to Assad's ouster. Turkey has also been given credit, but its role in these events was largely passive. President Erdogan didn't give the signal on when the war should begin. He didn't provide direct aid to the fighting. Um, Turkey was pursuing its own interests. It was quashing or suppressing Kurdish separatists. It's been doing this for 30 years. And but Kurdish separatists based in Syria uh, became an ally of the United States in fighting ISIS. Um, and in the course of the time, and we don't have a map that actually shows this, but uh, the Kurds in Syria have occupied maybe as much as 1/5 of Syria, as well as in the north and the northeast. But it includes the gas and oil producing areas as well as the grain producing areas. Turkey sent troops into Syria. It gave security to the Idlib pocket. Idlib is up here if you can see, in the northeast or the northwest of the country. And it's one of the governorates or provinces of Syria. Um, it's sort of the last holdout place for the Syrian opposition. Turkey protected it. They sent troops into Syria. They gave security to this pocket, and this is where the rebel group HTS, earlier known as Jabhat al-Nusra, earlier affiliated with Al Qaeda, now disaffiliated with Al Qaeda. But it was in Idlib that HTS established a government. They call it the National Salvation Government. Turkey did this for two big reasons. It was not. It was, yes, maybe to benefit the people of Syria was a side reason, but the main reason was to prevent the Kurds from taking the whole of the northern strip of Syrian territory. And this is because the Kurds in Syria are related to the Kurds in Turkey and Kurds in Iraq, and there's been a separatist movement called the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, and they've talked about basically separating themselves from Turkey, and that's to say to break up the Turkish state. So Turkey wanted to prevent Kurds from taking the whole strip of the northern part of Syrian territory, and the second reason was to prevent the Assad regime from expelling the from expelling more citizens. As Robert just pointed out, there's a huge number of Syrians who are now forced to live abroad as refugees. And in Turkey, it's like 3 million people. And the fear is, there, like everywhere else, refugees, especially in immense numbers, do wear out their welcome, and they've been there now for more than 10 years. In terms of getting credit for who did what and who made what happen in Syria, I think the real credit goes to the Syrian people. This was a bottom-up revolution. As Robert pointed out, it started far from the capital of Damascus in 2011. It spread like wildfire through the towns and cities of the country. It was peaceful. It was purposeful. And there was no ethnic or sectarian agenda of the people rising up. They just wanted to get rid of a regime that had been there at that point for 40 plus years. It was widely described outside of Syria as a civil war, but in reality, this was a war by the Assad regime against its own people. Assad tried to stir it into a sectarian war. He bombed Sunni mosques, and I saw them during my trips into Syria, deliberately aimed at mosques to destroy the spirit of the largely Sunni Arab population. He
And
tried to,
Roy, let
yeah.
me interrupt for a moment. Can you briefly describe sort of the different sectarian alliances that existed during the war? And just to get us going, we know that the Assad family was from the Alawite sect, a very small minority that had most of the leadership roles. But who were who allied themselves with the Alawites? Where did the Shias fit in? Where do Sunni Muslims fit in? Where do the Kurds fit? Where do the Christians fit? Where do the Druze fit?
Well, it is a country with big minorities, but it's also a country with a big majority. The big majority are Sunni Arabs. Um, the Alawites might make up 10% of the population. Kurds might make up 10%. I don't know the exact percentage of Christians and Druze, but essentially Christians were more or less protected by Assad throughout not just Bashar al Assad, but his father Hafiz during their terms in office, which added up to 50 years. Um, Druze were often on the outs with the Assad regime, and many Druze allied with the Sunni Arabs, who, as I say, made up about 70% of the population. There is a Shia population. There are other minorities who mostly tried to stay out of the fighting and out of the demonstrations because they just knew it was going to end badly for them. Um, but um, but what Assad did was he took off against the Sunnis in particular, and most of those refugees abroad, and most of those displaced, in fact, are Sunni Arabs. Um, there were incidents in the course of this war which seemed to put Sunni Arabs against, let us say, Alawites. But in fact, they were incidents rather than a trend and rather than a pattern, or certainly rather than anybody intended. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was, if that answers your question, Robert,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
was the role of the United States. I mean, the U.S. is the major world power. It sets the tone for things. It protects the whole system of international responsibility and supposedly order. And the U.S. makes a real difference everywhere, even and when it doesn't appear in a place and doesn't have a role, things often just deteriorate rapidly. Not that U.S. presence and activities are a guarantee of stability either. But in the case of Syria, the United States did not do much for the Syrian revolution. No president, and I'm thinking of three of them, Obama, Trump, and Biden, took the revolution seriously enough to provide consistent aid to them in the form of, well, I mean, they provided humanitarian assistance, but I'm thinking of military support when the Assad regime basically turned on its own people. In fact, 3 years into the uprising, and it would have been about 2014, when the jihadist group ISIS had arisen out of nowhere and taken one control of 1/3 of Syria. The United States basically abandoned the Syrian revolution. They stopped talking to them, in fact, and they certainly stopped aiding them. Um, uh, Going backwards, 2 years into the uprising in 2013, Iran took charge of the ground war. Assad didn't have the forces to fight and to attack the Sunni population. In fact, so Iran basically sent in Hezbollah from Lebanon to capture at least one major city, and Hezbollah basically stayed and managed and was the lead force in the ground war against the people of Syria. Um, in the year 2013, and that was in the year 2013, there was hardly a peep from the United States government. When Russia intervened in 2015, again, in collaboration with the Iranian led forces on the ground, um, the Russian intervention was treated by the American government as entering into a quagmire. Russian planes bombed cities, uh, bombed markets, bombed uh, camps, and this is the most awful thing for the internally displaced who had no other home but these camps. And there was hardly any condemnation from the U.S. government. Aleppo fell in 2016, and it happened practically without comment. Now, Assad's goal in fighting his own people basically was to demonize the rebellion against him. He claimed that all of his opponents were terrorists, starting with teenagers in Daraa. Um, Meanwhile, he had his own intelligence agencies at work. They were carrying out operations, uh, uh, sometimes even against the government, or ostensibly against the government, blowing up government buildings. And then immediately and publicly, the Assad regime and its controlled news media would publicly attribute them to Al Qaeda. Um, in this, where ISIS came from is a complex story, and that's really why I've written a book about this entire war, because ISIS, its origins are really, really intriguing. Um, First of all, by the year 2014 or 15, ISIS controlled something like 1/3 of Syrian territory. Now, where did it actually? How did it get this much control in as little as 18 months after announcing its existence? Well, Assad actually handed over territories to these extreme jihadists. He did it without a fight. Then he complained to the world that terrorists were taking over much of his land. He actually went so far as to subsidize ISIS. He turned over oil and gas and grains, which is in the northern part of the country and in the northeast specifically. Sorry, the northwest. Um, and no, the northeast is correct. And then he complained to the world that terrorists were taking over much of his land. Um,
Roy,
sorry, yeah.
let me interrupt for a moment. It's because we're also getting some questions. I do want to get to more about both the president looking ahead a little bit. Let me ask about one particular player who has suddenly come to occupy a lot of thinking by the rest of the world. Where does this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, now we're calling it HTS, it stands for Organization for the Liberation of the Levant, come in? And who is its leader, the new titular head of Syria, Abu Muhammad al-Jilani? Where do they come into this portrait, and can you get them from 2013, 2014 to the present? And we have a fair number of questions about things going on in the present, but particularly when and how does HTS emerge, and how does it become how does it end up taking over Syria?
Well, I'll get back. I'll get to that in just a minute. I first want to deal with the competing Islamic group, which is ISIS,
Hmm.
because the two of them were in competition. ISIS created a caliphate, as I said, in just 18 months. Um, how do they do it? Well, my research was basically was not listening to government officials in Syria or anywhere else, but it was talking to defectors from the Syrian regime, from the Syrian government. And these were people from the security services, from the military, from the police, but above all from the intelligence agencies. And I interviewed scores of them. And I found the most interesting thing about my interviews, by the way, and this is the source of my information, is that only one or two of them was ever interviewed by the CIA. Uh, so the story of the rise of the Islamic State is really important, but and I won't go into the whole thing, but just to mention it briefly, that it would have been impossible for the Islamic State to take over all the territory it did um, if it didn't have behind the scenes support and even unofficial sponsorship of the Assad regime. Assad did not invent ISIS, but he contributed enormously to it. For example, how did people like Jolani and, in fact, other Al Qaeda people get into the country in the first place? Well, his intelligence services knew that they were crossing into Syria. This is in 2011 from Iraq. And they let them in, and they let them set up their own militias in Syria. The militias ostensibly were to oppose the Assad regime. And then when ISIS appeared at the gates of a city, you take Palmyra in the desert, in the Bodian Desert, Assad withdrew his own forces and let them capture the city without a fight. Uh, and as I said earlier, he also allowed them. He provided a subsidy to them. Now, this is important because Al Qaeda uh, divided into two different groups. It was in 2013. One of them was ISIS, and that was led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is an Iraqi. Um, that group, ISIS, fought against the moderate rebels. The other group was Jabhat al-Nusra, led by Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. They fought the Assad regime, and they fought alongside the moderate rebels. And I want you to know that in the early days, the Jolani forces did some very reprehensible things. As I say, these were people fighting alongside the moderate rebels against the Assad regime. It was then called Jabhat al-Nusra. That was the group he led. They abducted civilians, including American journalists. I heard this from Teo Padnos, who was held by Nusra for 2 full years. And I heard it from Diane Foley, the mother of the slain American journalist Jim Foley. Um, Now, he was not put on the U.S. terrorism list because of these abductions. I'm speaking of Jolani. It was because of car bombings and other attacks on civilians. Robert Ford, who was then the U.S. ambassador, who actually recommended that Jolani and Jabhat al-Nusra be put on the terrorism list, told me actually today that he said they wouldn't be recommended today. The case against him was not that strong at that point. Um, what did the U.S. government do? Well, it went to war against ISIS in 2014, and it dropped all contact with the moderate rebels. Instead, it formed an alliance with the Kurdish militia and went to war against ISIS with them. There was no long-term political plan. There was no plan for the day after. It was just an arrangement of using a proxy force that worked for a time in fighting the remnants of ISIS. But today, now that there's no Assad regime, you have to ask what is it going to lead to? If we go fast forward to today, and this comes to your question, Jolani, and his real name, by the way, is Ahmed al-Shara. He stayed in Syria, despite huge setbacks for Jabhat al-Nusra, and basically the loss of the force of the Syrian revolution, the moderate rebels. He stayed in Syria. He took advantage of the fact that Turkey was really upset to have the Kurds, the Kurdish force, taking territory all along the north of Syria. And Jolani stayed in Idlib. He built up a force. He trained a force. They created this government of national salvation. 3 million people were basically ruled by this government, which was put in place by Jolani and, as I say, protected by Turkey. Um, and um, and they came to dominate the Idlib region. Maybe half of the 3 million people there were displaced from other parts of Syria.
And
So
Roy,
yeah.
Roy, I do want to get us to the present if we can. What are the sort of what's your read of the early signals from Jolani now? He's moderated his public remarks. He's promising an Islamic Republic. He's promising an Athenian democracy. Where are we right now with him? And then I do have a backlog of questions from members of our audience, but I would like to sort of get us into the present a little bit.
Well, yeah, and in fact, actually, that's where I'm heading right this minute. So Jolani, as I say, he's an Islamist. There's just no question about it. He came out of the Al Qaeda relationship. He was a member. He was affiliated with Al Qaeda, but his organization changed its name twice. And the latest one is Hariri. It's called HTS, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and they are disaffiliated with Al Qaeda. Um, so far, since they've arrived in Damascus, and even in the week of their march through the country and the takeover of city after city, um, they've been putting out positive signs. There have been almost daily messages of tolerance toward all minorities. They've been talking about plans for a Syrian government that will represent all Syrians. They keep on saying, and they are actually showing some signs that they want to prevent ethnic or sectarian conflict. Um, but you have to understand that, like any government that comes to power by force, as opposed to, and even some that come to power by elections, they feel real power and they want to exercise it. As I say, this is an Islamist-led government, but it's Islamists who say they want maybe not an Athenian democracy, but they certainly want a democracy.
And
Um,
let me bundle some questions together from members of the audience right now. If you're so in your description of where Al-Jolani seems to be right now, with no guarantees for the future, if you're Erdogan in Turkey or you're King Abdullah in Jordan, let's take those two, and let's say you're Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem, if you're and you're Ayatollah Khamenei in Tehran, let's go through these four: Turkey, um, Iran, Israel, Jordan. How does this week look to you in those four capitals? What does this week? What's your takeaway from this week? If you could take it country by country to put you on the spot.
well, you start with Iran, as you did, and that the Iranians used to, if we could draw a line, it would be from Iraq through the Syrian desert to Lebanon.
Mhm.
Iran was using Syria as a transit route to supply Hezbollah in Lebanon. And you're going to, but what's happened now is that that route has been interrupted. It's been interrupted by two things. One is Israel bombing Hezbollah, Israel bombing the routes, Israel bombing the Iranian positions in Syria, and including in the desert zone. And I will, in fact, we have a second map which can show you where the Israelis have been bombing. Um, and let me see if we can bring it up. Uh, and this means the halt to Iran's spread of its attempt at hegemony in the region. Um, if you see the Khazer crossing there on the left, that would be a crossing into Lebanon that was probably used for transit of weapons from Iran into Lebanon. And if you see Al Mayadeen to the right of the map, this is where this is one of the crossing points from Syria into Iraq. And so the Iranians are likely to feel very isolated at this moment from their proxy force, and and people in Hezbollah have admitted the same uh, compared to just 2 weeks ago. The Turkish government and President Erdogan has been uh, outspoken on this, uh, sees the Kurdish, it's not really a state, but it's sort of an entity along the border there with Turkey, as a very dangerous thing for Turkey. I mean, whether it's a real security threat or not, or whether it's just this is a political threat, is another question. But they want it. They want the Kurdish force, which is affiliated with the United States and with the U.S. military in fighting ISIS. They want that force absorbed and made part of the new army that is supposedly going to emerge in Syria. They want the leadership of that force, and it's got different names. The Syrian Democratic Forces, it's called, or the YPG is another name of it. The PKK is actually at the essence of it. Anyway, they want the leadership um, kicked out of Syria, sent to the extent that they are from Iraq to be sent back into northern Iraq. They want they want these organizations all dissolved because they see them as a threat to Turkey. Uh, Turkey is in a position to actually make it happen on the ground because they have a proxy force of their own. They're made up of the Free Syrian Army rebels who have been supported and supplied by Turkey. And of course, Turkey, for them, it's a very short hop for their aircraft, for their fighter planes to attack Kurds. And that takes us actually to Israel on the other side. The Israelis, as you can see from this map, and this is not complete, this is only from December 8th, and there have been hundreds of bombings in the meantime, have themselves taken it on themselves to take territory out of and expand their holdings in the Golden Heights. They're talking about building new settlements there. And Israel has also been talking about the Kurds. And they've been saying that the Kurds should be allowed to keep their leadership and to keep their presence in the north of Syria. This puts Israel and Turkey into almost a diametrically opposed position, and it could put them into a conflict. And this is something really dangerous, and it's kind of amazing to me that the United States has not taken a greater role and had a greater presence and done more on the ground and done more in terms of diplomacy to prevent this from happening. But now, have I covered all the countries you were
I
looking
want
for?
to ask about King Abdullah of Jordan. What is his wish? What would he like to emerge from all this?
It's pretty clear that certainly during the war, King Abdullah allowed the Free Syrian Army to have sanctuary in Jordan. He allowed the CIA to support the rebel forces, and he very much hated Assad, and I'm sure was is very happy to see him go. Um, to have a stable democratic Syria to somehow head off the Iranian use of Syria as a transit route, and the Iranians throwing their weight around is clearly one of his goals as well. I think that the developments in Syria have been welcomed without reservation by Jordan. But as I say, there is this risk that in the absence of an American role right now, an American efforts to head off things, you could have a regional war coming out of this, and that'll be no good for Jordan. That'll be a disaster. Not well, it'll be a disaster for all parties, and starting with the Syrians themselves.
What would be your advice for this interim period between now and mid-January when the new administration takes office? And what would be your advice to the new administration? What what should the United States do or not do in regards to Syria?
Well, the first thing is it should be present. It should have a person there. It has to overcome the antipathy to a group that was once affiliated with Al Qaeda, and reach the conclusion that these are the folks who are in control now, and to try to help them work with all Syrians, including the Kurds in the north, um, to settle things down, to bring law and order, to try to restore services. It takes a top official from the United States. It could be a special envoy. It could be the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. There's any number of people who could be sent in to Damascus to work with the new leadership there. Um, and that's they're missing in action right now, and
Do you need to take
it's surprising.
HTS off the terrorism list?
It could be done, and it should be done, because the case against the HTS, as I mentioned earlier, was kind of a weak one. And it's
Mhm.
and besides, these are the folks in power, and their terror operations, so to speak. The blowing up of cars,
Mhm.
even the holding of hostages, were not really directed any major sense against Western countries, against the United States. They were internal issues, and as I say, the case against them is pretty weak. But the main thing, Robert, is that you need to have a presence. You need to have a policy. You need to decide what is the goal. What is the day? How do you want the day after to look? I mean, you look at the Kurdish force in the north. They occupy territory, they run territory, but they are a minority group that has not been elected to do this. And in fact, they have an affiliation with a terror group themselves, with the PKK. They're holding thousands of prisoners of ISIS. They're a non-state actor. How can you hold prisoners of war if you're a non-state actor? What happened? What is the plan for the day after? There seems to be no U.S. plan, and that is something that should. That's if I were Secretary of State, that would be my first objective: is to devise a strategy, to devise a plan. The U.S. has been absent, since they basically dumped the Free Syrian Army in 2014. The U.S. has been more or less absent from Syrian politics. There was an exception during the first Trump administration. They did appoint a special envoy for Syrian issues, and the fellow was really capable and really an able diplomat, and circulated, and he had plans. He knew what everybody wanted, and he was working with all of them. His name is Jim Jeffries, and he was an
Oh,
ambassador to Iraq for
mhm.
years, which is where I got to know him. Um, he was not replaced when the Biden administration came in, and so they have had really nobody as a specialist. So that would be the first thing: get a specialist, send in a top official, work with the locals, the new powers that be, encourage them to reach out to the Kurds, for example. Try to figure out some way out of the Kurdish issue, and also come up with a view about what Israel is doing. Israel's bombing of installations in Syria goes way beyond just Iranian transit routes. It's you can just see from this map, and this map is old. There's just been hundreds of bombings. They
Right.
destroyed the Syrian Navy, which really has nothing to do with Iran at all.
There's a very good question from a member of our audience about prospects for traditional transitional justice measures in Syria, something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Could there be trials for senior, people with the responsibility for wrongdoing? I will tack on my own skepticism about the prospects for transitional justice measures in the Middle East. There's no track record whatsoever, not even a bad one. It's just, it certainly never happened in Egypt. It's never happened in Israel, Palestine. It did not happen, and there's no prospect of it happening in Iraq. But Roy, do you have some optimism that there could be some, I'll just sum it up, some truth and reconciliation efforts in Syria to avoid an endless cycle of retribution?
Well, at the risk of oversimplifying how Syrians reach their views on political developments and on the needs to how to settle the country into a stable state, um, it's being demanded all over the place.
Hmm.
I think just the death toll that you mentioned earlier, the torture, the prisons that just held thousands and thousands of political prisoners, um, have now been opened, and every prisoner has a story in a sense, and certainly all those who were killed deserve their day of justice. You're right to be skeptical about the history of the Middle East and justice, but I think Syria may be different.
Hmm.
I think because this was a popular revolution, because it was a blood, it was a peaceful revolution. It was unarmed at first. It was Assad who took up arms against his own people. And you had a regime that was basically mostly Alawite, very much focused on his family and his friends. You have a number of culprits. The other element that's kind of interesting is that there's been a significant effort by Syrians themselves, both to record the crimes that occurred, and there's a vast library of
Hmm.
millions of videos, obviously, but there's also professionals from other conflicts set up a kind of a warehouse to collect evidence and data on both who in the government from Assad on down was responsible for orders that led to massive crimes, um, and then there's informal Syrian NGOs that have collected it as well. So there's the data is there. I think the desire is there. I think that the facilities are there, but this is another place where the United States could also lend quite a hand to some kind of a process. It has to be an orderly process. I mean, the country will never come to terms with itself
Right.
if it doesn't have that. So it's an essential thing in the in Syria's future.
And several people have asked, we talked about how things look from Tehran, from Jerusalem, from Ankara, elsewhere. How do things look from Moscow? This is I'll offer some leading possibilities. Putin has made no mention of Syria whatsoever, I believe, in his public remarks over the last couple of weeks. Is this something, it never happened? There's no defeat. This doesn't matter to us. Does this really strategic defeat, or is this some blip and now Russia can just concentrate all the more on Ukraine? Something totally different? What's your read about how this looks for Moscow?
Well, I think politically in international politics, it's a huge humiliation
Mhm.
to see the local dictator who they supported with their military, certainly since 2015. But in fact, the relationship of Russia to, or even the Soviet Union to Assad Syria goes back into the Cold War period. Uh, so it's a huge loss for them in terms of prestige. Uh, Literally, you can see the Tartus there on the map.
Mhm.
Literally, they have two sea bases, naval bases, and then they have a place called Huinam, which is a air base, a major air base, and they've used these basically to supply Russian forces and Russian proxies throughout the Middle East. So they lose that. They lose the collaboration they had with Iran, which is the Iranians provided the ground forces to defend Assad, and Russia coordinated this with the air cover and air bombings.
Mhm.
So they lose that element of collaboration. Um, they I mean they lose Syria. Uh, they
Right.
they they were the lead. I mean, with Iran, the lead outside power, and that is no longer. As for Putin's silence on this, well, he's silent about a lot of things. He's silent about the losses in Ukraine. He's silent about really anything that goes bad. Uh, I mean, I think the Russians would like to keep those bases. I'm sure they would like to keep those bases. I'm sure they have little confidence that they can, um, because well, I will say this: I think the Syrians in general, certainly people I know in the opposition to Assad, who are now coming into power, uh, felt that on the whole they preferred Russia to Iran in terms of outside supporters of Assad, but they don't want either one.
And
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 furthermore,
and
as long as Assad stays in Moscow,
yeah,
and if there is a criminal process against him, you just think about it. The Syrians will demand his handover, and that's very unlikely to happen. And probably others from the regime will head to Moscow or to Tehran, and
you
so
know,
that becomes a burning issue, a continuing issue.
we have about 2 minutes left, and I suspect we'll go over a couple of minutes. So let me just bundle two last questions together. One of them, it's from the audience, it's another capital that's worth thinking about. How does this look from Kiev? How does this look from Ukraine? And last, and again, we're it's at 6:59. Remind us again why Syria is important to the United States, but Ukraine, and then Washington, and then we're going to, I think, be done.
For Ukraine, I think this is a kind of a feather in their cap in a sense. They've depicted Russia as an invading force that uh, has been, inhuman in its punishment of the Ukrainian people, and with an immense appetite for other people's territory. So the fact that Russia has been sent packing in a sense in Syria is something they will certainly have Schadenfreude about.
Mhm.
I'm not sure that it actually changes anything in their war significantly, because Russia didn't have that big a force in Syria at the time of Assad's fall. Um, but it has to be it's a kind of morale booster for Ukrainians that Russia is not the almighty power it claims to be. And in fact, that is sort of the long-term picture of Russia. It was really aspiring to be a world power again. And I think that this removes it from that list. It's now down to a regional power that is fighting a bitter war against its immediate neighbor, that where it basically invaded and is using everything it's got against them, and has not won, and really actually has no immediate prospects of winning there. Um, to your second question about why does Syria matter? Well, first of all, I have to say that several presidents seem to think it doesn't matter and decided to walk away from it. I think that's a huge mistake because Syria has been written off for the longest time as a place where the United States could have no impact, basically. I think that may be the reason that the current administration decided not to send in a special envoy like Jim Jeffries again, that there just wasn't that much that they could do. But right now, it is a place where there's a lot you can do, and where, in fact, it could help be the cornerstone of a new Middle East in a way, if it turned out that it had a more or less democratic process, even if it's led by Islamists. But if it was stable, if it was part of the international system, if it has law and order, if it has an economy, and it has many aspects that lead to the potential of a good economy, and it's there. If the U.S. we'll put this, let me look at it from a negative side. If the U.S. doesn't support the new order in Syria and try to help steer it into a positive track, then it opens up a vacuum which others will fill, and they may fill it in the worst possible way. We just don't. There could be chaos, and it's in nobody's interest in that region. I mean, look, Syria spills over into Lebanon, and you may say, well, does Lebanon really matter? But if you have a stable region, it benefits Israel. It benefits Jordan. It could lead to stability in Iraq, and who knows? It might even rub off on Iran. There's so many reasons, and you can say we're not getting our oil from Syria, and we never have, and we probably never will. But it's a country of 25 million, which is right there, smack in the middle of. And it can be a source of progress, a source of democratic development, which most Americans governments have thought will never come to the Middle East. It could be a source of economic development, and so on. The absence of American role could lead to just the opposite. And this is not a high cost intervention. This is a case of using diplomacy to its best, economic aid to its best. The judicial precedents that we have in dealing with criminals. The whole example, Syria could be part of the modern world. It should be part of the modern world. We could help make it be part of the modern world. But we have to be present, and we have to be in there pitching.
I do want to thank you. I want to thank the many people who joined us for the evening. It's been great to have not just an expert, but an in-house expert.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank the audience very much for attending and joining in with your very good questions.